IVM.
The fact remains that the tongue has a lot to offer in experiencing what a wine is really about, or even a food for that matter. So whether white meat with white wine or red meat with red wine, all these rules don't matter if what you're sensing on the palate is not in alignment. And even those rules are changing now, because if you see, the wine world has also become very diverse. The wine styles that we are drinking these days, I mean, who would have heard that Czech Republic, other than making beer, also makes fantastic wines?
My guest today, I met him in a beautiful restaurant in Delhi called Qla. And after that, became a very good friend. I knew him originally as a restaurateur, and then later on discovered this more fascinating side inside him, which I'm going to refer to as his sommelier side. But I always known him as a connoisseur of wine. Welcome to the Filter Coffee podcast, Prateek.
Thank you, Karthik.
You would have realized that I struggled a lot with this introduction because it's just a mouthful of French words that I couldn't really do justice to. But tell me, before we begin the episode, what is the difference between a sommelier and a connoisseur? So,
interestingly, both are French words.
Okay.
Because, as you would have sensed, they sound equally beautiful and tongue-twisting. But, see, a connoisseur is anybody who, let's say, has this love for wines and wants to experiment, goes out, gets into the nitty-gritties of what kind of styles they like or the kind of wine they want to appreciate. So over time, you become a connoisseur of wine. As against a sommelier, which is more of a professional connotation, where traditionally in France, a sommelier was a wine waiter.
Oh, okay.
So you would have restaurants with nice, interesting cellars, and it was the sommelier's responsibility to not only serve wine, but also make sure that at the back end, your wine inventory, your service standards, everything to do with wines was basically taken care of as a specialized section by this person. And you would be called a sommelier.
Right, understood. So you would like to be addressed as a sommelier, and I just realized how much I just called it sommelier some time back, or a connoisseur.
Well, I think I'm at a stage in life where I am a qualified sommelier. At the same time, I, thanks to my exposure to the wine world, after especially having lived in France, I am pretty much a connoisseur, but I'm not a wine snob. I like to make matters easy and not too complicated.
Jokes about Prateek. I think you're one of the finest minds I know when it comes to wine. What does wine mean to you?
I think for me personally, it goes beyond just being a beverage. I think it's wine is a very thought-provoking, a very emotional and a very multi-sensorial experience. Because if you look at it, there's a lot of history to it. There's a lot of, when I talk about the taste attributes, there's a lot of complexity to it. It is an agricultural product, so there is this artisanal, more hands-on kind of a human interaction to it. So what really goes inside a bottle is just beyond just being grape juice or any other alcohol. And again, it's not something that, once you've bottled a certain wine, it doesn't change. It still keeps evolving.
Right.
So there are so many dimensions to wine that it's not just about getting high on an alcoholic beverage. And honestly, if you go by the sensorial attributes of wine and once you start appreciating it and breaking it down and spending time with it, you won't even get drunk, I promise you, because that's the kind of qualities wine possesses. And of course, it's a low alcohol beverage. So that's what wine means to me, that, it's just not something you gulp down just because you're broken up with your girlfriend or you just feel life is too unfair. It's actually an emotion.
Right. And we've spent time together. I've seen you appreciate and talk about wine to a point I'm even tempted to tell someone that find yourself someone who loves you the way Prateek loves wine. Right. But this journey for you started sometime in the middle of your career.
So yes, so I am a hospitality graduate. I studied hotel management, hospitality, even tried to become a chef, but I knew that I would be horrible at it. But then somewhere in 2008, I took a plunge into the career of beverages. So my first really assignment began talking about different beverages from beers to spirits. And then somewhere a year later, a year and a half, I realized that wine is still something I don't know much about. I started looking around. I had nobody to guide. Wine was still a novelty in India.
But why wine? Why weren't you looking about single malt or beer or any of those?
I still remember very fondly, especially in my college days, in my library, when I would read those thick wine encyclopedias, those images of those nice, pretty villages in France. They would really attract me. I think it was, again, something very emotional that, I would look at it and I would be just traveling through those books. And every time I would flip those pages, I'd be like, oh, I'm better off probably going there and experiencing it.
Right.
How, when, why, I really can't recall, but that's where the whole interest really built up and it started. So in 2010, while I'd quit my job and I was learning the language, I said, okay, I think Burgundy is my place to go to. And that's where I just left in the summer of 2010, only to, of course, keep my parents amazed and amused that there's something like wine which one can study being an Indian.
Right.
So 2010 is where it really started. So yeah, it's been almost a decade now.
And you spoke about the history of wine some time back. And, I was recently in Cyprus.
Yeah.
And there was this... I forget the name of this god, but he was considered the god of wine.
Right.
And there is this legend that wine originated in present-day Iran.
Right, that's right.
And then there was a bunch of casks which, were floating in the sea because of a shipwreck.
That's right.
And that's how Cyprus became like the home of wine, etc.
Yeah.
But then there are like alternating theories of it originating in Georgia.
That's right.
China.
Armenia, in fact.
Armenia. What is the most accepted story about the origin of wine?
So if you see, thanks to the evidence and the carbon dating, a lot of it is owed to Georgia in general, because of these, especially the specialized containers in which wine would be fermented in those days, something called amphoras. So when people discovered that was the main service and the storage ware for wines,
right,
you can actually track it back to Georgia and parts of Armenia.
Georgia is such a cold place.
It is.
I would have never thought that would be like the origin of wine.
Exactly. And especially with the orange wine that they make, which is one of the most classical styles of what ancient winemaking was about.
Oh, wow.
Has still survived the time. It was just that the conditions and the relations with Russia kind of limited them in making more reach out there for wine to get popular. Otherwise, that's where a lot of evidence exists. In fact, as recent as I think last about a decade ago, they also found evidences in Israel.
Oh. Okay.
So even they had places where they believed that wine was frequently moved from one place to another. And again, they found those ceramic pots, big ones, where they would have probably taken them in carts or just stored them in, the warehouses or cellars deep under their houses.
Right.
So even they are showing now signs of where wine could have originated.
Right. So basically, wherever wine is supposed to be originated from, it's a conflict zone. Basically, wine is trouble.
It is. Right? It is. Yeah. But if you see commercial winemaking or wine in general, it traveled the most because of the Romans.
Oh, is it?
So wherever they would go.
Sicily is another place that the people attribute origin to.
So Romans, wherever they went, and especially where they conquered, they actually took the wines with them.
Okay.
So they would literally take up big farms and just grow wines there. And then commercial winemaking as we know it, or even the French for that matter, a lot of the wine expertise that they have is owed to the Romans. And that's how it traveled the world.
Oh, okay.
And especially also then even with the monks and the Roman Catholic Church, that's how also they traveled.
Right. I can tell you one place that it did not travel to, and that is Tamil Nadu. I think all my young adult life, we grew up with one brand of wine called Golconda, which I don't think you will touch with a barge pole. I wish there were more Roman colonization in the south of India. But tell me, there's one myth that, you started the episode by saying you're not a wine snob.
Yeah.
There's one myth that I always wanted to ask you about in a public forum and get your official response to this. Is there's a research, that the expertise of wine is often inconsistent, right? There was actually someone who had written an article in a European magazine which said that, he tried 3 different types of wine with the same wine experts, and their own opinions were not consistent, right? Is wine appreciation also a very, at this minute sort of a thing? Is it very emotional as well?
It is. See, the beauty and the limitation for any human being is that you can only do or experience as much. So, for example, if you speak about wines, I've gone through tastings where you start early in the morning at 10:30, 11 a.m. And all through the next 6, 7, 8 hours, you're just basically sitting in one place and assessing wines, which basically means that if you've tasted a few red wines, which typically have those tannins, which give you that, dry feeling in your mouth or kind of numb down your palate, your assessment for future wines also becomes a little challenging.
Right.
And yes, it is about the time of the day. It is about the body chemistry. It is about the kind of wines you've already tried earlier in the day, which are making you sense the wines differently. So yes, I wouldn't be surprised that on a given day, I might superbly appreciate a certain wine, but the next day it might not be as overwhelming as it was.
Right.
So that human limitation, as I said, it is possible. Right. And even for the best of the critics, because the wine world is so vast and so diverse, you can't know everything consistently and archive it the same way.
And that's the other question I had, right? Like, why is wine so beautiful but unapproachable, in the sense that one is often lost.
Right.
Whether it is it's a wine store or it's a wine cellar, or whether it is just reading about wines.
Right.
Does it have to be this complex, or is that what adds beauty to the whole appreciation of this?
So I'm of the opinion that wine, being diverse, will always have so much depth. Right. That it's always a journey. You'll keep exploring. But I'm also of the opinion that it should not be made as complex as it has been done in the last few years.
Right.
Why would that happen is because a lot of times, as much as we love wine or we want to know about wine, maybe we don't want to give it enough time to just kind of break it down and say, we'll have a little more systematic approach to this discipline. And I dare say discipline, because I feel it is just like a lot of other interest subjects like art or a sport, it is a matter of discipline. So if you invest time, you'll see you start breaking down wine into certain compartments where you start preempting what you might like or might not like just by looking at a bottle. So for example, when I do my wine sessions under this community I run, which is called iWine, the very first question when I'm starting off a wine tasting is, I ask my audience, do you like it? The very first question for anybody in my audience is, do you like it?
Right.
It can be a white wine, it can be a red wine, it might be a sparkling, a champagne, it could be anything. But if the first sip itself tells you that, oh, I like it, you already started with that journey. And once you've opened your mind to liking a wine experience, and as I said, once you start investing that time and that discipline and start breaking it down, wine can become intuitive. And as I said, you can start preempting what you like and what you don't. Another way of doing it could perhaps be that, okay, in your mind, let's say you feel like having wine one day and you're lost in a store. Just tell yourself, do you want a white or a red? Even if you answer that basic question, by natural process of elimination, you're on a 50-50. You already got 50% of the options removed, and you know that out of those rest 50, maybe you could have tried, let's say in a white, a Chardonnay. So why not try a Sauvignon Blanc this time? Maybe you've tried both of them. Why don't you try a Riesling this time? So it's also that process of elimination which helps you try new wines every time.
Right. And, you mentioned your first question to your audience, and I'm reminded often of a situation in restaurants, which I've experienced millions of times now, is when the waiter comes and pours an amount of wine in your glass, and then you swirl, you sniff, and then you sip it.
Yeah.
I have never told someone I don't like it. Like, what's there to not like about it? Right. And I also feel like I'll probably offend him if I tell him, like, it's such a big charade. He's opened it, he has his towel, he's holding it like that, and he's pouring it. Right. I just don't have the heart to tell him I don't like it, bro. Right. But have you seen people who do that?
Well, again, the same philosophy of you like it or not. That's how I team at even the restaurant at Qla is trained. That the very first time, let's say you come across a guest. And again, being in the hospitality business, you start, because you meet so many people, you analyze so many guest demands, you see different situations. You start gauging as to who is a newbie when it comes to wine drinking or who already knows what they want. So my training to the team again is that the moment you see somebody who's not acquainted with wines at all, make them comfortable. The moment you pour something, don't even tell them what they're drinking. Just ask them that, do they like it? Because a lot of times, what you said as a guest, you've already been through so many difficult names on the menu. You've already seen the prices. You don't know where to put your money and your bet on. You are also under this pressure that if, let's say, you're with somebody, you're hosting someone, a client, or you're on a date or an important day celebration, you of course want to not make those mistakes. Right. So the idea is to first put you in a comfortable spot and say, okay, you might not know about wine, but here I am taking care of you and just asking you whether you like it or not.
Right.
And let's say at any given point in the restaurant, I have 8 to 10 options, the bottles which are already open. So if you're not convinced with one, I can offer you another one after that. So by the time you're on the third or the fourth wine and I have understood what you might like, the chances are you'll not say no to it. And that's how a good sommelier or a suggested wine selling can happen. And that's what opens up the conversation. And you're right in your space that, when you talk about how can a wine even, you can go wrong with it, that whole thing is eliminated.
Right. You spoke about looking at the price tag, right? And I'm actually reminded of this other podcast I was listening to, from which I understood the initial contact between man and wine, right? And I want to say it's the Mesopotamian region,
right.
But I might be wrong. One of the earliest known uses of wine was to mix it with seawater, to make it more portable and less saline.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was so that water can be consumed directly from the sea, sort of thing. Right. And I'm talking about early civilizations and how they used wine, etc. Right. Now, from there, you look at the history of beverages. Of course, whiskey and malts always had their own premium trajectory. Right. And somewhere along the lines, beer became like the poor man's drink. Ale was always the working class drink.
Right.
And at some point, this thing that was, largely like an aquaguard for ancient civilization suddenly took a premium route, right?
That's right.
Is wine overpriced across the world?
Well, in India, it surely is a lot of times.
Right.
Specifically talking about India, of course, a lot of it is because of the taxation structure that we face in especially the imported wines. And let's say if you have to get something from an Australia or a Chile or a South Africa, the amount of duties starting from a customs duty all the way up to the state excise adds up as a simple calculation. So let's say a $1 wine, let's say in a US or in any other place, that same wine you'll probably be spending 7 times, 8 times over when you're consuming it in India.
Oh, really?
Yes, but a lot of it is because of what exists as a taxation structure.
Okay.
So every additional rupee adds up because you're talking about 155% of customs duty. You're talking about different slabs for excise duties as per the state. So all in all, as a consumer, what you end up paying is far more than what you would have done in another part of the world.
Is it a very Indian-specific problem?
It is India-specific, yes. Right. But if you look at even other parts of Asia, like Thailand is very highly taxed when it comes to wines.
Okay.
Hong Kong is the most liberal. They have almost zero duties on wines. Singapore, to some extent, manages fair pricing, but it's still on the higher side. But yes, the world over, if you see the perceived value of wine, there is definitely a premium attached to it. And I would not entirely say it's unfair because the amount of effort that goes into putting together a good bottle of wine, it's a lot of different things happening at once. So you're talking about some really prime real estate. You're talking about a whole year of hard work because unlike other crops which might see multiple harvests, wine goes through only one cycle and you can harvest it once. So the entire year of making sure that your grapes are well looked after, it's a very hands-on job. And then, sending it to different parts of the world, maintaining wineries, keeping hygiene standards,
Right.
the hard labor of just putting it together, all of it adds up. And hence it commands a premium as compared to, let's say, something brewed in a big factory and then distributed through very efficient models.
So it's by default a very artisanal
It is.
farming experience
It is.
when
It
compared to other
Yes.
beverages. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful. On that mind-altering note, we'll take a very quick break. We'll be right back on the Filter Coffee podcast. And when we're back, I'm going to ask Prateek about some myths about wine choosing and wine drinking. Stay with us.
Hey everybody, welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. The greatest place on earth to work on. If you're interested in working with us, please do send us your resume, careers@indusvox.com. We're looking for people in business roles. We're looking for people in creative roles. We're looking for audio engineers, graphic designers, all kinds of things. So please do apply. Also wanted to ask everybody, please tell a friend about your favorite podcast on the IVM network. We really do depend on your word of mouth. You are our biggest ambassadors, and we'd really, really appreciate all of your support. Also, if you are enjoying what you listen to, take a screenshot, tag us on social media, and we will repost that. This week on Cyrus Said, Cyrus is joined by Eva Budd. She's the head of Bollywood content at 9X Media. Eva recounts some of her favorite and not-so-favorite experiences interviewing Bollywood celebs, her new podcast, 9XM Soundcast, available on the IVM Podcast Network, and displays her singing talent. This week we're launching a new podcast called Football Should Ball. It's hosted by 3 diehard football fans, Gaurav Sapre, Sivram Parmeswaran, and Karthik Iyer. Tune in to get your weekly football fix that brings in-depth analysis along with unhinged banter. First episode releases on Wednesday, 7th of August. On the season finale of Not Just Dansak, Bhavi Bride Parzen Patel meets Chef Bawa Farhad Kurkaria, also the co-host of Keeping It Queer. They talk about the varieties of dansaks and how there's no one way of cooking it. On Simplified, Chuck and Naren are joined by guest Tony Sebastian for part 2 of the history of the Cricket World Cup. On Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch, Janice and Anirudh talk about the critically acclaimed Emmy-nominated show When They See Us. On The Origin of Things, Chuck narrates a story about the early internet, smut, and an unlikely investment. On What a Player, Mikhail Admeda is joined by comedian Joel D'Souza to discuss cricket, football, Formula One, and of course, darts. On the Habit Coach podcast, Ashton Doctor talks about journaling and narrates examples of prominent people who maintain journals of their lives. He also explains how to keep a journal and learn more about your mind. On the Empowering series, Zarina Poonawalla is joined by the managing director of Genetic Callnet Consultancy, Vishal Keswani. They talk about how you can discover a suitable career and how to deal with conflicts in any industry. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Welcome back to the Filter Coffee podcast. We're speaking with Prateek about wine. Prateek, before we went on the break, you spoke about why there is a certain inherent cost to producing wine and why it is sometimes more expensive than other beverages. I want to quickly move from there to some of the myths, that we all have, like as laymen who are not sommeliers of wine. One of them is also the most important question, right? And I often struggle with this, is red or white, right? And for me, it has always been, if it is too bloody hot, go with white.
Yeah.
And if it is reasonably pleasant outside, go with red. Right?
Yeah.
And it is also this one winery tour that I took where I realized that red actually is a much more aged sort of a wine, and I don't know if this is even correct. So I always thought of white as like a wannabe wine. So these are, as you can tell, really stupid factors that are driving my decision. Right? What is the expert point of view on red or white?
So if you see, I would say that there is a wine drinking cycle that you go through when you are discovering wine. If you remember, initially I said how wine is actually a journey. It's not a one-day process. It's not something which, let's say, you've already subscribed to and it kind of gets over. It's a lovely vicious loop that you commit yourself to if you really want to become a wine drinker or a connoisseur. So in a wine drinking cycle, what you typically go through is when you start drinking, you always like wines which are lighter, perhaps white, a little more sweet with a little bit of extra residual sugar. Then you start graduating towards a little more bolder in your face flavors. For example, if let's say you started wine drinking with a white wine like Riesling, a New World or a German style Riesling which has a little sugar, chances are you'll start going towards, let's say, a dryish Chardonnay From there, you'll probably enter the zone of red wines, which have wines like Merlot or Cabernet, which you come across very often. From there, you start getting into even, again, more mature styles, wines which have been aged for 20, 30 years. They are more expensive than the previous counterparts when you had started. The flavor profile, just the opulence of the wine is far better than what you would have tried earlier. So you're literally going through this trajectory. And then towards the end of your wine drinking cycle, chances are that you would come back to whites again. But this time, those whites are not the, let's say, the sweeter ones or the ones that you started with. But again, white wines which can age up to another 20, 30 years. For example, some of the best Chardonnays from Burgundy. So this is what typically a wine drinker would experience.
Right.
And when it comes to exploring or even starting off and saying, hey, what do I drink? You can simply just grab a bottle. White or red doesn't matter. But yes, the chances are if you don't know too much, you might like an off-dry style of white wine.
But you don't make, as an expert, a distinction between white or red. For you, both are
wine.
Both are wine.
I would love to add even that there is rosé and champagnes and sparkling wines.
Right, like
which
I
add
don't
to
even
the complexity.
recognize its presence, so I didn't bring it up. Like I hate rosé.
Is it?
Overall? I just feel he's a very confused person. Right. Couldn't figure out if it has to be here or there.
That's perhaps another myth which I think we should help people get rid of.
Please explain. Yes.
Because rosé is something again which is seeing a big revival. So rosé typically is what? It's in between a white and a red. If you were to make a nice rosé, typically what you would do is you would start making a red wine. You start with the fermentation, but just enough for those grape skins to stay in contact, to give that color, but then you take them away. So rosé itself can start as a red wine, but you basically take away the skin grapes and let the remaining juice ferment and then just develop that pink color.
Right.
The beauty of rosé is that they're very versatile. As compared to a white or a red, which can sometimes be extreme, rosé, because of being in the middle somewhere, they are versatile for food pairings. They are really good for casual picnics. You can just go easy with the rosé and not even realize that you've had wine, but it's still solid flavor profile of red fruits, currants, whatnot. So rosés, yes, they might not be the most aged or sometimes the most complex wines, which especially the serious drinkers might say that, oh, it didn't do much to me. However, when you're somewhere in the middle of that wine journey, or if you just want to experience something different, rosés make the perfect match.
And then there's this, I don't know if this is true in mainstream, but there's always this effeminate angle that people attach to rosé.
Exactly.
So men often stay away from especially in Delhi. Right? Is that even correct? Is it even justified?
I think it's the visual cues which kind of makes you feel that pink is not for men.
Right.
But as I told you, I think roses for me, especially when I wear my sommelier hat and I'm doing a lot of food and wine dinners or just enhancing that food and wine drinking experience, I always throw in a rosé or two.
Right.
Because they really do match up even to the Indian food very well. So yes, I think the color connotation is what really makes one not have it. But I would like to see that change. And
so I'm drawing a lot of parallels to something that I do know a little bit about, which is coffee.
Yeah.
In a way, coffee, the different ways in which you can brew coffee, even though it's from the same beans. Some of it is like a very slow brew sort of thing, like filter coffee, and then some of this is fairly quick brews, which are much more flavorful, like what we do with the French press, etc.
Right.
So in a way, just to take this red versus wine thing to a logical conclusion, what you're saying is there's no inherently better wine. So given that, and both are just different ways of getting to the same end, but given that, what is the thumb rule, when you want to choose between red and white?
Okay. So if you're choosing a white, know whether you like a sweeter, younger style or something more complex. So for example, if you don't want to think too much, the moment you see Riesling on a label in a white wine and you don't know anything about the wines and neither does the fellow drinkers whom you're enjoying that bottle with, chances are everybody in that room will like a Riesling.
Right. That's like the greatest common denominator.
Yes. Riesling by default, I think it pleases everyone and anyone because sometimes the sweetness, sometimes this petrol-y aromas to it sometimes the fresh fruit, everybody kind of resonates well with it. When it comes to a red, in an Indian scenario, I've seen the Merlot, which is Merlot. It's again a French word. Merlot seems to find a common liking amongst all kind of drinkers. So it's nice and juicy. It's well-rounded. It's not very dry, and it's not sometimes, at least in India, you don't find very aged or complex examples.
Right.
And even with Indian food, it kind of goes fairly well. So Merlot is that crowd pleaser when it comes to reds, at least in India. Another grape which I feel, and again, India can appreciate more, is a Pinot Noir in reds, which is, in my opinion, the white grape of the reds. It might not make a very overwhelming kind of a statement when it comes to flavor profile. It's very subtle. It's delicate. It's more feminine within the red grape varieties. But again, if you are looking for an easier style without too much pretense and you just want to have a bottle, you might just go safe with a Pinot Noir.
Oh, wonderful.
So that's how I would look at picking up a red as a thumb rule.
Excellent. Shifting gears, one other myth that exists is all wine age beautifully, right? And, like 5 years back and before we got to know each other, I used to just keep some bottles of wine for forever in my cupboard, thinking they'll just get better. It's wine, right? But that's not true, right? It's only lately that I realized that most wines actually should be consumed within a year of its manufacture, isn't it?
Yeah. So if you see, that is perhaps one of the biggest myths. Most of the wines, especially in the current times, are made to be drunk young. That almost attributes to about 80%. So not all wines will benefit from aging. And when we also say aging, they have to be under certain controlled conditions.
Right.
Let's say if your wine storage is exposed to direct sunlight, the cork bottles are not lying down, maybe you have too much of humidity, or basically any extreme weather conditions, and let's say any foul smells, they'll always affect how your wine also ages. And most of them, as I said, about good 80% are meant to be drunk within a year or two, or sometimes let's say 3 on an average. And that's where most of the wine is being consumed. So if you really want to pick up wines which are there for aging, we also spend a premium on that, because they must be some of the more complex wines which sometimes go up to 30, 40, 50 years and they've survived the time. Yeah, I mean, it's believed that 1945, World War, they are still wines which lasted almost 5 decades. People were opening them as late as late 80s and early 90s, and they were some of the finest vintages, especially in red wines in Bordeaux. And similarly, there are examples in France, in Italy, and other parts of the world which have seen wines evolve, but not all of them.
I'm probably asking you the most difficult and insane question ever asked on a podcast, but can you explain to me how a really fine aged wine feels different from its younger version?
Okay. So there are wines which will visibly develop a change. Let's say your color would have changed. Like, for example, something like a Barolo or a Brunello from Italy, they go through this oxidative, tinted, almost amber kind of color from where they were in their youth. When it comes to taste, it's very difficult to put in words. So yes, I am. I think this is one of the most difficult questions I've been asked. But like I said, if you archive your wine journey, let's say if you start making notes early on and you start seeing the evolution of your own palate, you will realize that the very first wine that you had, or let's say now you fast forward and compare it to something that you're having now 10, 15, 20 years later, it is again a very personal experience, but there is a difference. For example, there are certain wines which must be super tannic. They completely dry up your palate, the side of your cheeks. You can't sense anything when you're having them in their youth.
Right.
However, you let them sleep nicely in your cellar for the next 10 years or 15 years. You see that they mellow down. They start becoming more rounded. If, let's say, the fruit component of the wine wasn't showing forth, it'll start doing that now after that decade. So there is a marked difference. However, you've got to be more self-aware. You've got to, as I said, archive and remember what you had 10 years ago. And there is a sea of difference. Better or not will always be subjective. In fact, there are certain wines, if you miss the drinking window, as we call them, if you don't drink them at their peak, they'll only disappoint you maybe later on.
Okay. So there's a diminishing return.
Exactly. There is a diminishing return as well on wines.
Wow. Okay.
If you see. And a lot of times there are bummers which we keep encountering. Like, I still remember as a student, I was offered this wine from 1937.
Right.
The label completely gone. You could barely make out that it was 1937. The vintage, it was as vintage as it could get.
Right.
And I opened this in 2010 with one of my professors.
Oh, wow.
There was nothing left of that wine but just vinegar. So somewhere in that drinking window, we clearly missed it, or my professor who had stocked it nicely.
Right.
And it was just, I think, the vintage value which kind of, just amused us. That's all.
Right.
But that's what every wine drinker goes through. Sometimes you miss it, the wine will completely disappoint you.
Right. And then you mentioned tannic and then, making your mouth dry sometimes. And I often experience this with wines which don't come with a cork, would come with a screw top thing. So I have two questions, right? One is, and again, this is part of the wine snobbery playbook, which is wines with a cork are better than wines without them. Firstly, is this true?
Not entirely. A lot of wines which have been on screw caps have shown to be good, or rather comparable to ones in the cork. However, it is safely or on an average assumed within the industry that your wines which have been bottled in the cork will last you longer because of the mechanism. The very essence of having a cork is, thanks to the cellular structure of the cork, the wine, when kept lying down, will age in a very uniform manner with just enough breathing for the wine to happen even through the cork. Otherwise, the wine can abruptly age as well. Like sometimes we see this problem in screw caps that a wine put 20 years in screw cap as against 20 years cork. The one under screw cap wouldn't have been tasting the same in terms of the drinkability. However, the cork would have survived that. So for longer aged wines, unless more successful scientific experiments keep happening, cork will still be a preferred choice. However, the only limitation you see in cork sometimes is that it can leave us kind of a very oxidative note or a stain taste kind of off flavor behind, which is associated with the natural wood. Because you can't, sometimes if you don't control it or treat it well, it spoils the wine inside.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's another challenge with cork wines. And that's where, in fact, the kind of term which is called the wine is corked also came from. That your cork was responsible for spoiling the wine instead of keeping it well.
Wow. Okay. But I also noticed that the ones with the screw top, when I open them and then consume them immediately, they taste horrible. But when I let it oxidize a bit, then they become sometimes even awesome.
Yeah.
Right? Is that something that one should do for most wines?
Yes. Whether screw cap or the corks. One rule which I go by every time I'm opening a bottle is let it just breathe. And when I say breathe, wine is, as I said, it's an agricultural product. It's a living thing. So what you're really doing is every time you're leaving a bottle open after opening it is you're letting the oxygen go into it and mixing with the components inside the bottle and really showing the true attributes of what a winemaker or a wine was supposed to be about. So, like if you see, sometimes we decant the wines in those nice crystal, glass, beautiful looking structures. So the idea is to provide enough oxygen through and through so that wine, imagine trapped inside like a little baby, unable to show its true colors, suddenly opens up, breathes out, starts living in this open world and starts revealing the true colors and the qualities it's actually made up of. So do that for every wine that you open, whether white or red.
You're giving all the wrong vibes to the vegetarian inside me. I feel like I'm almost eating a live baby, but that's beautifully put. It has to come to its own before you can consume it. Right?
Absolutely.
Okay. And the other myth that people talk about a lot is also what you're having wine with, right?
Yeah.
I think the unsaid rule is red with meat and then white with fish, etc. Right? Is that correct? Is that something you would advise people to?
I would say listen to your palate first. A lot of times, see, basic taste attributes and flavor profiles, all of us as humans have been gifted with, thanks to this little tongue that we've been gifted with. Most of the times we are not aware of how we are using it.
Right.
I mean, I don't need to make any political statements about how we use our tongue. But the fact remains that the tongue has a lot to offer in experiencing what a wine is really about, or even a food for that matter. So whether white meat with white wine or red meat with red wine, all these rules don't matter if what you're sensing on the palate is not in alignment. And even those rules are changing now, because if you see, the wine world has also become very diverse. The wine styles that we are drinking these days, I mean, who would have heard that Czech Republic, other than making beer, also makes fantastic wines?
Oh, do they?
But that's happening.
Wow.
In fact, recently I tried a white wine from that place and had it with Indian food, which had that heat and the spice, and was just superb.
Wow.
So this little region called Morava makes wines, which is almost 90% of the wines in Czech Republic. But that paired supremely well with Indian food. Who would have thought?
Wonderful.
So I would say, for anybody wanting to have food and wine together, the first few times, give your palate that chance to see what is really going together, complementing or not. After that, yes, again, certain rules, white meat or fish with white wine, chances are you won't really go wrong with it. Similarly, a red meat with a red wine is a good idea. However, I love to play with contrast as well. So far we were talking about complementing attributes,
Right.
white and white, red and red. I like to play with contrast. So let's say if you're having something completely acidic, whether in your food or your wine, try and pair it with something completely mellow or soft. You will see that the acidity will take over and kind of help close that dish or that wine.
Like, can you give us an example of?
So if I think of it, let's say if I'm having a lemon sorbet, with that acidity, a natural lemon, not just flavor.
Right.
And if I try to pair it with a nice, very deep, intense wine called Trockenbeerenostles. That's a German style, which means that sometimes you can have up to 250 grams, 300 grams per liter of sugar in a wine.
Wow.
And you pair the two together. So chances are it would actually be going very well. So this lemon sorbet with its nice acidity and that cold temperature, paired with a Trockenbeerenostles style of wine, which has more of the orange, the peach, very tropical notes, and still a lot of weight because of the sugar that goes inside it. Because of this contrast, it would work very well.
Oh, wow. Beautiful. So if you mentioned Riesling and Merlot.
Yeah.
If you have to pair Riesling with an Indian dish,
Okay.
what would you go with?
I love Riesling in general. Again, just like the rosé I talked about, it's
Right.
very versatile. So I would take a Riesling, and I can. I think I would like to take one of. I know you're a vegetarian, so if I think vegetarian, I could perhaps take a tandoori broccoli, which is finished off with a little bit of a brush of some fresh cream. So that smoke, that creamy texture, along with that firm broccoli, and an off-dry Riesling. Let's say it has some little sugar. It'll go really well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
so that's one pairing which, in my opinion, somebody wants to try the next time around can go for that.
It's close to 6 p.m. and you're not doing you're not being kind to me at all. I'm extremely hungry just listening to this.
So that could be a good option.
What about if you had to pair a red with a non-vegetarian dish? Indian
If I have to do that, I would perhaps pick up a Merlot or maybe a Pinot Noir. No, actually a Merlot. And pair it with the butter chicken.
With the butter chicken?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And when I say butter chicken, also there's a very wrong notion about how butter chicken has to have a lot of cream and heavy dairy. By default, the butter chicken should be about the consistency, which should be like butter. It should be buttery smooth. This is the way you treat the spice and the tomatoes.
Right.
So if you don't have too much of cream happening there in the butter chicken, try it with the Merlot or even a nice, I would say, New World Pinot Noir. And when I say New World, I imply an Australia or a South Africa or a Chile who are still considered recent in their winemaking history.
Right.
So that could be a good idea.
Oh, wonderful. Something that is always, I always thought of is we don't really talk about music paired with our drinks as much as we talk about food paired with our drinks, right? Like, for example, intuitively, whenever I'm by myself or with family and friends,
Right.
and I'm listening to bourbon, I intuitively put on jazz.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Have you ever thought of music and wine together?
There is.
Yeah.
I think for me, when I think wine, it's a lot about jazz and blues for me personally.
Any wine?
Most of the wines.
Most of the wines. Okay.
Unless they are super casual and it's about just chugging a few bottles down when you're just in a good or a supremely bad mood. I would think of wine as jazz or blues.
Right. Oh, wow. Okay.
For me, as a pairing in my head, perhaps it is to do with the BPM, it is to do with the frequencies at which these genres operate.
Right.
It's perhaps what wine does to the nervous system. I have a feeling, personally, that wine, jazz and blues are a great combination.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned what it does to the nervous system.
Yeah.
And I also know that your love with wine is much, much deeper,
Right.
and you take it beyond just as a
Yeah.
beverage, right? Recently, we had a conversation on wine and mindfulness.
Yeah.
But where are you going with that one?
So I think I'm at a stage where wine has become more than a drinking experience. So the beauty of wine is that you don't always need to take it in or ingest it to appreciate it. So even for us as wine professionals, we go through so many tastings that we spit it out. So the best thing about wine is whatever your complete experience is, you can go through that without even having a sip. So when you say, you slurp, you swirl on the palate and you're tasting the wine, you can spit it out. And while I'm doing that, I'm still experiencing the wine as somebody who's probably had a bottle, because the taste attributes won't change.
Oh, wow.
The only thing that changes when you ingest it is what it does to your system.
Right.
So in that way, I feel wine is so much more. And even for children, if you were to educate them early on about wines, I mean, the kind of alcoholism issues or the kind of abuse issues that you now see about, especially amongst youth, it wouldn't happen. I know I'm making a big claim on a public forum, but I am a sincere believer of that. And that's the reason why I've also started taking workshops with kids on how now with your natural exposure to alcohol and more options being available, you can still be sensible with it and enjoy something like wine. And I think that's the future, because at about 12.5-13% alcohol by volume average, there's no better option that exists.
Right.
And it opens up your senses to much more.
That's a very interesting way of thinking. So can I paraphrase this as people or kids who grow up with wine as their first beverage are less likely to sort of abuse such substance?
I think so.
Over a period of time?
Absolutely. I think so.
Right.
Because as I said, it leads to you questioning, you analyzing, you weighing in your experiences in a more open way, where you're not just there for an abuse or kind of overdoing it.
You're not just there for the hit.
Exactly. It's not about the hit. It's not about when it's in your stomach and what it does. It's more to do with what you're experiencing, as I said, within the palate. And when you scribble your notes, you wouldn't have, as I said, ingested any alcohol. Of course, when you're tasting, a few sips will obviously go into the system, but it doesn't do the same when it mixes with your blood in a bigger quantity. And hence, I feel if kids are kind of taken through that early on, they won't go into an extreme of, binging or kind of any trouble later on with the drinking issues.
That's a beautiful thought. And, I want to close by asking you, Prateek, what are your favorite Indian wines?
Okay. One wine which I lately liked is actually in Bangalore. It's called Charisma, and I hope I pronounced it right. It's KRSMA.
Oh, wow.
So they're doing some fantastic Cabernet Sauvignon, the red wine. So I would recommend that whoever is in the South, if you get your chance, I think they're also available in Andhra, and I'm not too sure Tamil Nadu or not, but Karnataka and Andhra, they're definitely there. So that's one wine I would recommend for everybody.
My favorite Cabernet for years has been the Big Banyan.
The Big Banyan is again a great example.
Which for some strange reason you get only in Bangalore, Goa and Bombay.
Same, yeah. So it's more confined to the South and the West. So I would recommend that too. I've been very impressed with this another small, more boutique winery called York, which does 100% white grape sparkling wine. It's called Blanc de Blanc. If I'm not wrong, I think they do a Chenin or a Chardonnay. So excuse me for not remembering the exact blend, but that's a very good example of a sparkling wine also being made in India. And these 3 wines have kind of boded well with me. Even the Fratelli Sette, they do this small batch, limited production, very international Italian kind of blend in India. So it's again a little more premium, but I think it represents what India can also do in the wine space.
But the York one is a very competitively priced
It is.
one, isn't
they
it?
got the pricing right,
And we spoke about the Riesling, and I absolutely love the Sula Riesling.
Yeah.
All the water bottles in my house are Sula Riesling bottles. Right?
They've again done a good job with that.
Yeah. Very nice. And one wine that I was very, very hesitant about because, the only wine with the name of a person I knew earlier in life was with Coppola.
Okay, Coppola,
I didn't quite enjoy that experience at all.
Right.
So when I found a wine bottle with Vijay Amritraj in it, I was like very, very skeptical. But I really ended up enjoying that wine a lot. It's not bad at all.
The Viognier, I believe.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm personally at that style not a big fan of it. I found it a little bigger and a little more alcohol to my liking than what I am used to. But yes, you're right. Normally, names on the labels and the wines haven't really worked well in the past, including Inglenook, which was Coppola's winery, Francis Ford Coppola's winery.
Right.
So yeah, but still there's so many options there that, like I said in the beginning, when you start trying out, just go with an open mind and just pick up a bottle that you feel is new or you don't know about without any pressure, and just try it and ask yourself the question, do you like it?
Right.
Or hashtag, do you like it? In today's world.
Absolutely. And, we met at Qla, and I consider it one of the most gorgeous restaurants to dine out, especially in the winter in Delhi. What's next for you?
So we are now definitely looking at expanding. We want to open more restaurants. Food, of course, will be food, and the wine experience is going to be paramount for us. So we're looking at getting into different formats. It might be only a wine-led format. It could be a smaller space, which is more into casual dining. Or we don't want to open too many Qlas because it's a very dear baby. It's been brought up with a lot of care. So we don't want to dilute the brand too much. So you might see sub-brands or different outposts, but maybe of a different character, unless we find something very similar in other part of the country or the world to open it in. Besides that, yes, wine is going to take a lot of my more time with the community I run, which I talked about. It's called iWine.
iWine. And it's also called iWine on Instagram. Right?
That's right. It's called iWine Official. Right. So it's about just sharing about wines and developing that little community within India, the subcontinent, where people can freely exchange about wines, get to know more. We'd be doing a lot of events, which we've also done in the past. Like, again, thoughtful events like Wine and Art, where we talk about wine, not just not a wine glass and you start painting on a canvas. When you're talking about wine in the context of an art therapy. So when I think of art, it also opens up my senses. And when I open those senses, I can even appreciate wine in a very different psychological way. And with that, I start making my own personal references.
Right.
And when I put them together, what you've got is your own wine nomenclature. Wine is also an art. So we try to address that side of it in a wine and art session, which I actually do with a professional who's an art therapist.
Oh, wow. Wonderful.
So things like
that. I definitely
those.
want to catch one of those sessions.
And if you like your pizza, we also do wine and pizza. That's another one.
Really?
We tell you how to roll a pizza. I pull out a few wines which are specifically paired with certain styles of pizzas. You learn it hands-on, tasting and making a pizza, and with those wines.
Right. Rolling something and a wine sounds great. I'm going to leave it at that. I think that will be an interesting workshop as well. And, we spoke a lot about wine and understanding and appreciating this.
Yeah.
If you had to recommend one book or one video, one source to the audience, what would it be?
Right. So I think one very good...
Besides following iWine.
Right.
Of course.
One very good start would be a Oxford Dictionary for wine, which was written by Jancis Robinson. They keep coming up with the revised editions. So what it does is it kind of gives you like an Oxford Dictionary format, like a whole glossary of everything that potentially exists around wine and the subject. broken down into small topics alphabetically. So it becomes like your quick flipping reference of anything to do with wines.
Oh, wow.
So that's a good source. Videos wise, interestingly, there's not too much content. However, I can definitely recommend anybody watching Sideways, which is a great...
I love the film. Absolutely love it.
So it's a great movie, even if you are not into wines, but just the fact that the kind of side it presents to wine, and with that being the protagonist, I think it's something which one must watch.
And Paul Giamatti is absolutely brilliant in the film.
Exactly. So you can't go wrong with it. And right. I think another fun way of exploring wine is these manga comics, Japanese style.
Really?
Yeah. So there's a whole series of it. It's called The Drops of God. Very interesting plot. There is a very acclaimed Japanese sommelier who passes away, and he has this whole wine cellar to be inherited, which ideally should go to his son. But there's a twist in that plot. Why? Because his son has to really prove that he's worthy of acquiring that cellar.
Oh, wow.
So what he does is in his will, he actually puts his son, who sells beers for a living, in competition with the best sommelier in Japan. And these guys have to blind taste those wines to conclude as to which wine this father was talking about. And is actually broken down into series.
Wow, what a premise. What an absolute...
It's just amazing. The whole plot thickens the way they, guess from one wine from the other. There's a close tie and the whole mystery around it. It's just, and you learn about wines in the process. Right, that's the fun of it.
Amazing. Hey, there's so much more to talk about wine, but we completely out of time. Thank you so much. This has been superb.
Thanks for your time once again.
Cheers.
Thank you.
So that was our show. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And filter_coffee. That's coffee with a K on Instagram.
The most engaging and the most useful conversations you may have in your life are likely to be with your most challenging customers. Hi, I'm Ambi Parmeshwaran, and on this podcast, I will take you through my book, Sponge: Leadership Lessons I Learned from My Clients. Packed with real stories about real people, but most of all, packed with the innumerable lessons I soaked up from some of the most iconic business leaders like Ratan Tata, Azim Premji, S. Ramadorai, Karsanbhai Patel, M. Damodaran, Dr. Kurian, and many more. Don't forget to tune into the Sponge podcast. Keep sponging to keep learning.
Janice, what do you think couples did before TV was invented?
I don't know, go for walks on the beach, long drives, fancy dinners, have more sex maybe?
But what did we do when we decided to move in together? We debated between the Chromecast and the Fire Stick.
We gave up on sleeping early so we could stay up watching true crime shows.
We got ourselves 3 cat babies.
And basically became the cutest couch potatoes around.
Okay then.
In case you guys still haven't got it, we are a TV crazy, Netflix loving, binge watching Mr. and Mrs.
I'm Anirudh Guha.
I'm Janice Iquera.
And if like us you snort TV for breakfast, lunch and dinner, this is the podcast for you.
Tune in every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app or wherever it is that you get your podcast from. This is
Mr.
and Mrs.
Binge Watch.